Aurelian, in many respects, he ends the crisis of the 3rd century, but it isn't over yet, is how I would
Mm,
describe that briefly. On the surface, you have a Gallic Empire, and you also have a Palmyran Empire, and also the borders are being overwhelmed by Goths, Carpi, and Alamans. All of those are sorted out by the end of Aurelian's over
five.
5-year reign. But his death is almost a sign of the fact that it isn't over yet, and it's not really until Diocletian that the crisis finally comes to an end. I think Aurelian definitely stands out as a great emperor. Not only is he able to come to terms with the military challenges of the empire, but is able to do it so quickly as well. I mean, within 3 years, roughly, he's taken out the Goths, the Carpi, which he settles on Roman soil, the Alemanni, destroys the Palmyran Empire, and also takes out the Gallic Empire through Tetricus's help.
Mm.
By that point, in sort of the 4th and into the 5th year of his reign, he is starting to sort things out.
Yeah, I think.
What do you think of
I,
Aurelian, Byron?
I have to go with. I mean, controversial to be, you know, going for this rank when no one has received it yet in our 3rd century one, but I'm going to have to give him an excellent. I think if we had more details, I'd say, on his tactics and strategies, I suspect we wouldn't have trouble mentioning him in the same breath as Caesar and Hannibal and those lots. He was clearly so good at war, this guy.
Yeah.
You know, the amount he gets done in 5 years is really quite incredible. I mean, the amount he has to move back and forth across this empire. You know, his victory over the Euthungian invasion of Italy. The Euthungi twice invade Italy early in his reign, and he defeats both. And his victory in the second invasion is sufficiently major that it really does. After, you know, we've had Alemannic invasions of Italy under Gallienus and Claudius. After Aurelian, we don't see Italy, unless there's some example I'm just not thinking of right now. Italy isn't invaded by barbarians until Alaric and Radagaisus. Yeah. So he basically ends the problem of invasions of Italy by barbarians. He's, as I mentioned earlier, his victory over the Goths is highlighted by Ammianus as kind of the big one. And certainly invading the Gothic homeland, it's a big move that none of his successors had done, except for Aemilian before he usurped as emperor. And he defeats Carinus, who was killed in battle, and there's an argument to be made that, I mean, it's no way to prove it, but Carinus is plausibly Cniva, a Greek-inspired attempt at making the East Germanic name Cniva more palatable to readers, which we see a fair bit with Germanic names and other non-Roman names. They get Latinized or, you know, Grecified.
Yeah.
So there's a case to be made that Carinus is Cniva, in which case, you know, this person who twice badly defeated Decius in battle and who captured Philippopolis through clever tactics and who repeatedly demonstrated clever tactics managed to get offed by Aurelian. If that's the case, that's a pretty big tick in Aurelian's good column. You know, he defeated the Vandals. That Vandal invasion in winter of 270, 271, early in his reign, it was a big enough invasion that Aurelian had to order the cities to take in the cattle and the villages outside. They had to be abandoned and brought into the walls to try and do a scorched earth against the Vandals. And even we're told that Aurelian fought them a couple of times, and the first time it was actually an indecisive battle, which shows that this Vandal group were not pushovers. Likewise, the Euthungi managed to get an ambush on Aurelian, which he incredibly managed to recover from when other emperors probably would have been butchered by their men after that. So it shows that his enemies, his Gothic, Euthungian, and Vandal enemies, weren't minor, and he managed to defeat all of them in a little over a year's time from his accession in late 270 to the end of 271. He accomplished all of those campaigns while also dealing with the revolt in Rome.
Yes, the workers' revolt, which
yes,
is a very interesting thing because it's one. I think it's the only time in Roman history that mint workers actually revolt and proclaim, is it Felicissimus?
Yes.
I don't think, is he
Yeah.
proclaimed emperor?
I don't think he is, but I think what actually
He leads the revolt, though, I think.
I think actually that's often how it's presented, but I think one source actually says that he was actually what happened was that Aurelian, because Aurelian was also very anti-corruption. Something about the mint in Rome was, I guess, hoarding the bullion for themselves.
The impression is it was utterly corrupt. They were minting coins without any silver in them.
Yeah.
And
so
when you make a coin, you have the precious metal you put into it, and also an amount of alloy of other metals, so like copper or something else. It's like the sestertius contained zinc as its other metal to give it a bit more value. But they were keeping the silver for themselves and then just bashing out fakes, basically, for the coins. So
right.
You've got this going. And actually a major problem during the 3rd century crisis are counterfeits and fake coins, which, coming back to that passage I read out earlier, and that public trust in the coins they're minting disappears. People don't trust these coins anymore because they're either fake, they're either worthless, or some variation thereof. There's also lots of variations in the standard of coins being minted. So like one example is during the reign of Gordian. Under his reign in Antioch, they're minting coins at 43% silver, and in Rome they're minting coins at 36% silver.
Right.
It's all a bit of a jumble. During this period, which leads to one of Aurelian's main acts during his reign, which are his coinage reform, to try and bring some order to the chaos that was the coinage by this point. Some of the things he tries to do is he tries taking bad coins out of circulation, which is a good idea, because another problem caused by having more and worth less coins is inflation and price rises. So the price of things is going up because there's no confidence in the monetary system, and people are having to try and scramble around for coins which are worth something to pay for anything. Taking out some of the fake coins is a good idea because it helps to improve trust. They are slightly revalued, and they are marked to show the people using them that they have a guarantee of that value.
Of like 5% silver, I think is the 20 to 1, isn't it? I think that's what it. So it went from something like, what was it, 2? Up to 5.
It's doubled in value.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, it's not solving the crisis, but it is trying to mitigate the chaos that has been caused by this.
Yes.
And also there are other things. He increases the grain dole in Rome and also adds pork and wine to the public distribution, as well as grain.
I think maybe oil as well. He was going to introduce an oil dole and a wine dole, and I think maybe his officials dissuaded him from doing one of them.
I don't know what real effect that would have had, but maybe just to foster goodwill amongst the Romans after massacring all of their mint workers.
Yes, well, because that's the thing, like getting back to that mint workers revolt, incredibly, while defending against this Euthungian invasion of Italy, it seems to be around the same time, it might be Eutropius who mentions the specific sequence of events, that he arrests Felicissimus, the treasurer in Rome, and has him summarily executed for corruption. That leads the mint workers to revolt. That leads to major street fighting where Aurelian, after he defeats the Euthungi, has to march on Rome and defeat these rebels. And in the process, he also appears to have used the opportunity to clear the Senate of some of his rivals because, lest we forget, they supported Quintillus.
Yeah.
And Aurelian does have a reputation among the Latin sources, not so much the Greek sources, for being a little bit overly ruthless.
He is accused of being very violent during his reign.
Yes. And I think it might be Eutropius who kind of says...
I think it is Eutropius.
I think he says that he was ruthless, but we needed someone ruthless.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the reason why the Greek sources seem to be much more positive about him is because, and again, I think it's a big point in his favor as a military man, is after winning all these wars and securing his control, he then, in 272, invades the Palmyrene Empire. He does this big two-pronged pincer movement with Probus, the future emperor, going into Egypt and then marching up through the Levant, while he marches through Asia Minor into Syria. And he does this consistent policy of clemency, which causes Zenobia to hemorrhage supporters, because he makes this point, and he first makes this point at Tiana, which we mentioned earlier, is where the soldiers wanted to sack Tiana for resisting Aurelian, and there's this whole anecdote where, because he supposedly was so irritated that they hadn't surrendered to him, that he said, "I won't leave a single dog standing." But then he thinks better of it, and he's thinking, well, we can't just have a siege of Antioch and a siege of Emesa and a siege of Apamea and a siege of Palmyra. We need
all of these Roman citizens.
Yeah, and sort of slow them down and make them vulnerable to epidemics and vulnerable to Zenobia's army. And so he adopts this policy of clemency, which he had also made very clement offers to the Vandals and the Ithungi earlier. And the Vandals took the deal and were actually, some of the Vandals were absorbed into his army. But he told the soldiers, ordered that they, he said that they wouldn't be sacking the city. They got very upset, as they did with Saturninus and Postumus for similar offences. I mean, supposedly his joke was, all right, kill all the dogs. They kind of found this funny and backed off. But I mean, no matter what happened, it seems that Aurelian managed to successfully implement this policy of clemency in a world where that would usually be a death sentence for an emperor, which is quite incredible. His tactics against, I won't go into them in detail, but his cavalry and infantry tactics against Zenobia were pretty impressive. Not only that, he then, at the end of that all, he returned to Thrace to deal with the Carpi, only for Palmyra to rebel again, and this time he showed up so quickly that they couldn't even put up a resistance. He then marched into Egypt to deal with Zenobia supporters under Firmus, defeated them, took Alexandria, strangled the leader. After all of that, went for the Gallic Empire.
Yeah.
And in one of the most incredible instances in, I think, Roman history, because he was probably fearing Aurelian at this point, because this guy was seemingly unstoppable, but also because he did not trust his own army, because the Gallic army was increasingly... so by this time, Victorinus had been replaced with Tetricus, and then Tetricus had to deal with the usurpation under one Faustinus. He was not trusting his army anyway, and so he basically sent a letter to Aurelian saying he'd willingly surrender to him. And it looks as though, from Aurelius Victor's account, that to achieve this, Aurelian basically dictated that he would lead his army into a vulnerable position and then he could switch sides. So essentially he could then butcher the Gallic army, which he proceeded to do in the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields, which is probably, which we know to be a part of Gaul that would be very favourable to cavalry, which Aurelian excelled in. So he had this great combination of clemency and military know-how that worked really well for him, and just got so much done in such a short space of time. I mean, the last year of his reign after that was still, he had to campaign in Gaul again, because by defeating so many Gallic soldiers that had compromised the Rhine frontier, and so then he had to deal with that, and then so on and so forth, had to deal with, yet another incursion to Thrace, and right here as well. But so I think from a military perspective, it's hard to fault him. Corruption, he was very anti-corruption, both among the soldiers and among administrators. Inscriptural evidence shows that he built many, many roads, which I guess was going to be very necessary for that level of campaigning.
Oh yeah, that's another thing I'd bring up about his military expertise, is not only is he able to defeat all of these empires so quickly, he is able to maintain the logistics of feeding and moving his army from Italy through the Balkans down into Anatolia and Syria and Egypt and up into Gaul and then down and back again. 5 years, which is impressive.
It
is. The amount of marching and is very impressive.
He also, and he did expand the mints. I mean, we've established that Valerian was a key part in that.
Mm.
We know that even more mints started being built under Aurelian,
He
which I guess.
consolidated a few, so a few that Valerian had set up were closed down. I think it's partially
Yes.
they weren't needed anymore, and moved into more central areas like Siscia.
I think he also, I mean, he closed the one in Rome temporarily because of what happened.
Yeah.
And I think he made Milan into his principal mint. There appear to have been a couple built in Thrace that didn't last for very long, but were kind of evidently sort of temporary mints.
Yeah, minting houses to pay his army.
Yeah, so he was clearly putting a lot of effort into that. He opened a mint in Tripolis in Phoenicia. He closed the mint in Trier, but opened one, I guess because of the Gallic regime, but then opened one in Lyon. Yeah, I mean, so we got all that. We've got the grain dole and also the wall of Rome. He built the wall of Rome after the Euthymnian invasion.
Which you can still see today, which is...
Yeah. It got added upon by, our later emperors like Maxentius and Honorius, and by early modern rulers as well.
Yeah,
I think to his credit, this is not necessarily, this is a matter of speculation, but it does look like in the last couple of years of his reign, he was starting to think about the succession as well. That's a potential criticism you could levy against him, is that he was a one-man show, it seems. Like he
didn't immediately have a successor like many of his predecessors.
I mean, we know that he had, he did make use of competent subordinates like Probus, and he set up one Marcellinus as the sort of the corrector of the East, and Placidianus in Narbonese Gaul became his praetorian prefect and eventually a consul. So he was using competent figures in important positions, but he didn't set up an imperial college. What we can see is that in 274, his wife, Severina, starts appearing on coins throughout the empire. Every mint except for Tripolis, there are coins being minted for her. And so that suggests to me he's starting to think about dynasty and succession. He probably just didn't have a son yet, or if he did, the son was a baby. And this isn't yet a world where you make a baby an emperor. Constantine was the first to do that, making Constantine the
second emperor 2 years old.
Yeah, that is the first instance of that happening. So, and the last point in his favor, I do have two criticisms, but the last point in his favor, I'd say, is like Gallienus, when he was assassinated. So he was assassinated because his secretary Eros had been doing something corrupt, you don't know what, and fearing Aurelian's wrath, he forged a list of basically, sort of a list of people to be executed or prosecuted by Aurelian. Yeah, as a way to kind of basically to entrap these high-ranking military officers into assassinating the empress to save themselves. But what that did, they then had to flee the camp, and when they realized they had been duped, they supposedly tied Eros to a tree and had him eaten alive by wolves. That's one story. But in any case, they had to flee the camp. The soldiers were blindsided by it. They clearly weren't expecting or anticipating his death, and they deferred to the Senate to choose a successor. Well, after that, Tacitus, the eventual successor, made a point of trying to hunt down these assassins, and Probus continued to do so, and it was Probus who finally killed them. And we're told the soldiers, they mourned the death of Aurelian, and it sort of shows that, like Gallienus, Aurelian was a loved emperor when he died, which again is a rarity for the period. This isn't a military rebellion, this is a court conspiracy.
Yeah.
But I guess the two criticisms I have, and one of them plays directly into that, is he seems to have been overly severe when it came to corruption.
Execution was the lenient option. Well, there's one thing to note about his reign, which is interesting. Eutropius mentions how he's the first emperor to wear gold on his clothes. So golden, rather than just wearing the senatorial toga with the thick purple stripe on it, he's the first emperor to start having a gold stripe. So you start to see this building up of the emperor is more than just a man and first amongst equals, becoming more the divinely appointed ruler of the world. And also Lactantius mentions how Aurelian was... It's not very clear because the part about it is partially lost, but it seems like Aurelian was planning persecution of the Christians, which
Yes.
was forestalled by his death and then not brought up again until Diocletian. But I don't know why. Maybe it's to do with his promotion of the cult of Sol Invictus, but it looks like he was going to reopen a closed chapter during this period unnecessarily.
You know, an emperor so restoration-minded as him perhaps still thought that maybe he thought that was something Gallienus had done wrong. That maybe in his mind, the reason Gallienus didn't reunify the empire was because the gods were angry with him. And we see that eventually again with Diocletian, that after Diocletian has these big victories over the Persians and Carausius, he then reopens the persecution chapter as well. So, yeah, it's an interesting case of Aurelian and Diocletian on these sort of parallel paths. Yeah, that they're not yet convinced that not persecuting the Christians, they still think it's a good idea. Yeah, the closed stuff is interesting, and it shows that Aurelian, like Gallienus and also Claudius, is on this path of the divine emperor, where he's meant to be the first emperor to wear a diadem according to the Epitome de Caesaribus. John Malalas says that he had a little star in his diadem, and he's the first time the title Dominus starts appearing on coins, just showing that transition into a more autocratic emperorship.
Yeah.
And he also, as you mentioned, he justified his rule through reference to Sol Invictus, which is also increasingly autocratic and quasi-divine. Presumably, he saw some value in this in maintaining military loyalty, because there's an anecdote in the Peter the Patrician. The soldiers were getting upset about something. We don't know the context because it's a fragment, but they were getting upset, and there was a mutiny, and he told them, you're mistaken if you think you can decide who the emperor is. Only God decides who the emperor is. And then he executed a bunch of them. It'd be good to know the context of that earlier in his reign. Just to return to the severity, I think the conspiracy of sending a bunch of names around and that working does sort of suggest to me that people were probably a little too fearful of him, and that might be his fault. That maybe he was a bit too hard on that front. The other issue I'd point to, though, I think it's perhaps not entirely fair to the Roman understanding of the economy is not what it is now.
But the Romans had some understanding, but they didn't quite grasp how inflation worked, or like how to deal with it, and other stuff. It was much more rudimentary than it is today, or even in later centuries, like the early modern period.
Yeah, and I think in this case, that coinage reform that he does in 274 with the 20-to-1 ratio, David Potter and Clifford Ando, they've all kind of pointed out that if you look at prices through the evidence of papyri, it looks as though, and I think a source might say this, that he withdrew coins from the market of earlier emperors and replaced them with his 20-to-1 coins. We can kind of look at that from a modern perspective and realize, well, that is the sort of drastic change that might cause a lot of inflation, because people will lose their confidence in their existing coins. That seems to be reflected in papyri, where hyperinflation ensued from around 274. And so it looks like Aurelian may have inadvertently, through his new shiny 5% as opposed to 2.5% coins, may have inadvertently made the inflation even worse. It looks like he did from the papyri. Again, modern economists can predict that, whereas it's hard to expect Aurelian to do so. That is a notable failing that may have caused a lot of troubles that would persist for future emperors.
It's notable that he has two coinage reforms. He has a small one in
271,
and then the major reform. He has a full kind of basket of policies. After his reign, the coinage, it kind of stabilizes at the floor of its worth. It's not until Diocletian, and it's not really until Constantine the Great, that the monetary crisis really gets resolved. It's an ongoing thing. Virtually every emperor that tries to tackle it fails in some regard.
Yes.
I mean, to Aurelian's credit, he does try and tackle it, but I think the problem is he doesn't do enough. And I think Diocletian does the same thing in that he doesn't remove enough of the bad coins from circulation for his good coins to make enough of an impact. So that you've got, alongside these more valuable coins, you also have all of these crap and fake coins which are also circulating. So you've got an element of confusion and also preference. So people will want to buy and sell things in better coins, but then give out all of the worthless coins they've got. So it's a bit of a palaver, really.
I guess also a factor in all of that is having usurpers, because usurper coins then become of questionable worth. And I think there is a papyrus from Gallienus' reign where I think, from what I remember of it, the official is trying to persuade people it's okay to use Macrianus coins. Actually, and it's because Macrianus is the emperor at the time, but clearly people aren't sure whether to use the Macrianus coins.
Yeah.
Back in Gallienus' time.
It also has the political trap of, if you're using these coins, are you endorsing that emperor even after he's dead? So I think that the fear of Biostars might be floating around as well. Probably not much to happen from it, but again, fear and mistrust and everything, it all impacts the economy in that regard.
Yeah, I think for me, overall, there's no perfect Roman emperor. You know, we can look at things Constantine did wrong and things Justinian did wrong and Augustus did wrong. Likewise, I think Aurelian was a bit severe when it came to corruption. He's probably overly ruthless with the Senate, although he also knew when to use clemency. And it looks like he accidentally caused some hyperinflation, which then stabilized afterwards. But I think overall, he's such an exceptional military emperor, and he also does do a lot in terms of the representation of emperorship, trying to make it more quasi-divine and imposing. The wall, the grain dole, dealing with corruption. There's so much there, roads and mints as well, that I do have to consider him obviously not a perfect emperor, but I'd say an excellent emperor.
I think you've convinced me to promote him to being exceptional, because even if you were to take one thing that has survived for Aurelian, which would be his walls around Rome, he left his mark on the world at the time, still today, which none of these other emperors managed to do.
I mean, the very fact of reunifying the empire leaves quite a
impression.
Yeah, it made the jobs of later emperors a lot easier.